Welcome back, everybody, to Rad JBI. And today, Anthony and I are doing another suspension
versus chassis episode. And in this video, we're going to be focusing on the compression clicker mechanism. This is mostly going to be for the forks. We will have a separate episode for the rear shock. But we're going to tackle how the compression clicker mechanism works, and most importantly, how it affects the feel of your motorcycle. Now, in episode 1 of suspension versus chassis, we touched on the basics of your chassis and suspension setup. What is a chassis adjustment? What is a suspension adjustment? And really drew that line in the sand between chassis and suspension. Episode 2, we touched on the topic of springs and sag and how setting sag has a crossover effect between your bike's chassis performance and your bike's suspension performance. Episode 3, we focus on fork oil volumes and its relationship between the bottoming cone on the KYB fork models and the spring perch. When it engages the spring perch, depending on how much oil you have in your fork.
Absolutely, yes. So now we've covered that, let's get into your compression clicker on your fork. Now, many of you are probably very familiar with this clicker. For the majority of forks that are out nowadays, so that would be the twin chamber style fork, the compression clicker is going to be the clicker on top of the fork. If you have a slightly older bike or a bike with what we call open cartridge forks, you are going to have the compression clicker on the bottom of the fork. Both work very similarly, so what we explain in detail in this video will still apply to this fork. However, all of our demonstrations that we have for this are going to be specific to the closed cartridge style fork, which comes now from Showa, KYB, and WP. The primary function of your compression adjuster is a way for us to modify how stiff or soft your fork feels. So think of this as a cushion to absorb any bumps, dirts, rocks, roots, or any irregularity in the grounds. And this is applicable to motocross riding, off-road riding, supercross riding. So regardless of the type of riding that you're doing, this still all applies. It's just that your bump or irregularity might be unique to your type of riding, meaning if you're doing a lot of off-road, you're going to see a lot more rocks and roots. If you're doing a lot of motocross, there's going to be a lot more braking bumps, maybe some rocks, but not really any roots. And if you're doing supercross, it'll be a lot of big jumps. So that's what our compression clicker allows us to do, is modify how stiff or how soft the fork is. And what I mean by that is how much resistance it takes to compress the fork. So think of when the wheel of your bike first strikes an obstacle. If you have a 2-inch bump, your fork needs to compress, or your wheel needs to compress at least 2 inches so it doesn't lift up the entire motorcycle. And that's what's cool about our compression clicker, is you might hit that bump and your wheel may only compress an inch or an inch and a half, so it lifts up the entire bike. And as a rider, that feels very harsh and not comfortable. So in that scenario, we could decrease the amount of compression resistance we have by adjusting the compression clicker on top. So before we get too far into it, let's talk about how the compression works and why it works. So your compression clicker has a clicker in the center cap, and the way we operate it is with most commonly a flathead. And what it is it is a machine screw. So as we turn this screw left or right, or we can say clockwise or counterclockwise, that is going to drive a screw in or out. I say it's mechanically operated because it does not require pressure for this clicker to work properly. So where there's no pressure against it, since it is a machine screw, as we turn the threads of this screw, it pushes our needle further in or further out. An easy way to think of it is, as we turn our clicker in, just as you would turn in a bolt, it's going to seal up the hole even more and allow for less bypass to take place. We have this clicker at the softest setting it can be. So what that means is it's going to allow the most amount of oil through the center of this and not force the oil to go through the valving of our shim stack instead. Now, this is the first time I've ever said this, but I'm going to blow this to show you how much air goes through it. Now, again, if I cover up these side holes right here, no air comes out of it at all. So again, we can manipulate how much oil bypasses or go through these holes with our clicker. So let's turn it in all the way and see how effective that is in reducing how much air I can blow through this. So as you can see, it seals off. So pretty much no oil is going to bypass our valving and go through the center of this and come out these side holes. Instead, it is going to force the oil to go through the valving and bend our valving open. In all of our A-kit forks and all our JBI spec forks that we have, we always install what we call a subvalve. That is going to be this part right here. Now, the main difference is they both have the center hole. So think of that as the inlet where the oil is going to flow through. And then again, it'll go through the center and come out the side. On this one, it's a little bit different. The inlet's the center, but we got 4 holes here at the base instead. And what happens is I can actually take shims and we can put shims to cover those holes. So what that means is regardless, there we go. So now we have turned our compression post into an additional valve. So again, this still is a valve, but how it operates is purely based on where our compression clicker is set up at. With our shim stack, depending on the shim stack that you put on there, it is now covering these holes. So the reason this is effective is because if we back the clicker out all the way to the softest setting, even though the clicker is going to allow a lot of oil to flow through our valve, the shim stack is going still to determine how much oil can freely flow through it. Now, subvalves are very helpful because for off-road settings, they allow us to always have a certain amount of compression damping, so that way the forks aren't too soft or overly soft. The off-road settings are still plush, comfortable, and soft. Again, they're just not overly soft because the subvalve provides a certain amount of compression damping at all times. The same effect applies for our motocross setups as well. Because on motocross, we're doing our best to blend the max amount of comfort, hold up, and bottoming resistance. So we're going to demonstrate why your compression clicker works and what pushes oil through that compression circuit. So to the left of me, I have a Showa fork cartridge from a 49mm fork. This is actually the Gen 2 Showa cartridge that we have. And I have oil inside of it right now. So what happens is when you ride and your fork compresses, this cartridge rod compresses and it goes inside of our cartridge itself. Well, when it does that, this rod is going to take up room or volume inside the cartridge and is going to push the oil higher up inside of here. What's taking place is that the damper rod is pushing oil through our compression circuit. By that, I mean our low speed valve and our compression piston as well. We'll call that whole piece the compression circuit. It flows through that, and then it pushes on what's called our free piston right here. And as it does that, it's going to compress our pressure spring. This mechanism up here, the pressure spring and free piston, this is similar to the nitrogen bladder in your shock, meaning this is what puts pressure on the oil inside of your cartridge. To the left of me, I have a cartridge from a WP Exact Pro. I like to call these the WP Exact Pro cartridges because you would find this cartridge inside of the WP Exact Pro 6500, WP Explorer Pro 6500 and 7500, and all of the WP Cone Valve / Exact Pro 7548 forks. They all feature this same style cartridge. As you can see, it has many similarities as the Showa cartridge we were just looking at. The difference is I already have the compression assembly installed in here. So what I'm going to show you is how this pressure spring up here, which is blue, so it contrasts this red really well, so you'll be able to see it. You'll get to see the spring get compressed as I compress the damper rod down below, just to help you guys further visualize exactly what's going on inside your fork as you ride and how the compression clicker and compression circuit is affecting that. So we've been discussing about how oil is flowing through the fork, and that is correct. That is what's happening. But a more accurate way to think about what's happening with our compression clicker is we're really controlling pressure. When this cartridge moves and compresses down, we're forcing oil again through the compression circuit. Now, the thing with pressure, it always wants to find the easiest route. So think the path of the least resistance. So what we're really managing again is pressure. And when we adjust our clicker, we are adjusting how much oil can bypass your valving inside of your fork. So the farther your clicker is out, meaning the higher the clicker number, the more oil can bypass your valving. So again, there's no resistance against it that way. What I'm going to show you is how effective your clicker can or cannot be depending upon what position the clicker is in. So right now we have the compression clicker backed all the way out. So by that I mean at its least restrictive setting. So this is about 30 clicks out from 0. So we can compress this cartridge pretty easily. Now what I'm going to show you is that if I turn this clicker in just 4 to 5 clicks, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, it's still pretty easy. It's pretty hard to pick up on the change. But as we get closer and closer to 0, the clicks will become more effective. There's another 5. I can start feeling the cartridge become much more resistant or harder to compress. What I'm going to do now is I'm actually going to go all the way in to where the clicker just stops. Cool. So that's going to be the stiffest setting. Now when I go to compress this, it is noticeably harder to push down. Like there's resistance from the very get-go. So what that means is the oil almost has no backdoor or alternative route besides going through the valving. And the valving is going to take a certain amount of pressure just to even open up. But what I'll show you is just going out 1 click from 0 to 1, the fork gets noticeably softer now, because we went from the oil having almost no backdoor or bypass to now having some. And even though it's a very small amount, that amount is very effective. We're going to transfer our scene, and I'm going to explain this again and hopefully in a more intuitive way so we can really hone down on this, because this is really important to understanding this concept. All right, guys, so your damper is a closed system. So what I mean by that is when we apply pressure to it, the pressure gets applied everywhere equally. So to demonstrate that, we are in Ant's truck right now. And what I want to show you is how effective pressure is in finding the path of least resistance. So we're in his truck, we got all the windows rolled up, and we got the heat going in it right now. So what that means is as the heater puts out heat, it's going to heat up this closed system, again, his truck, really well. There's almost no leaks or areas for the heat to leak out or go elsewhere. So what I'm getting at is think of this as your clicker being all the way in. So the most stiffest setting it can be, clicker 1 or almost even beyond that. So there's no oil bypassing your valve and it has to go through it. So what happens is the second I crack my window, even just a small amount, I can put my fingers next to the crack and I can feel the air rushing by. That's how quick and efficient pressure is at finding the easiest path possible. So just that small degree of change or cracking open that window has a really big effect now on how well the truck can continue heating up the cab. Now it'll continue doing it pretty well because of how small the gap is. But what happens is as I keep opening up the window more and more, less effective the heater becomes. So what I'm getting at, your compression valving becomes less and less effective as you open up your compression clicker. That's not a bad thing. You might be getting improved feel from that, but just trying to help you really intuitively understand what is happening when you adjust your compression clicker. Right now I got the window at about the halfway point. So by this point, we have a lot of air rushing out of the window, and that's really decreased the effectiveness of the heater. But what happens now is as I continue to open up the window more and more, that change is not nearly to the same magnitude or degree as the initial opening of the window. So in order to continue having the same effect or effectiveness of the clicker, you have to actually adjust your clicker more clicks the farther you get out from the 0 point. So what I mean by that is when our window is about halfway open, if you really want to make another big change, you almost have to open up the window all the way to allow even much more air to go out. What did you ask me earlier when we were inside?
Does the opposite apply? So if you're all the way soft and you go, let's say 2 clicks stiffer on your forks, is it as noticeable as going the opposite way, going from all the way stiff and then backing it out maybe 2 clicks?
Good question. So as you sit in this truck right now, I got the window all the way down. We can feel the heat going out the window to mix with the cool air. So if it was really cold out right now and we weren't doing this, and Anthony's like, JB, put up your freaking window, man, it's cold. If I only put my window up 3 to 4 inches, sure, it definitely has closed, but we're still losing a lot of air. through our window. So is it effective? Sure, like we visually can see the change, we can measure the change, we can count the number of clicks that we've changed, but I won't say it's as effective compared to having the window being closed and opening it. But what will happen is the closer we get to the window being closed, or your clicker being closed, the more effective each click gets. So if I put the window at the halfway point now, you can visually see a lot more is closed, and I can physically feel a fair amount of less air or hot air leaking out and mixing with the outside. And then as you see, it becomes more and more effective as I close the window. We can definitely feel the pressure increase. So meaning that how fast this heat is rushing out because we decrease how much area or volume it can flow through. And these last little bits is where it really adds up and becomes much more much more effective in terms of adjusting your clicker.
So some of the viewers may be watching this video and thinking to themselves, when do I adjust the clicker? So JB, if you're out on the track or trail, when is a good time to pull over and adjust your suspension clickers?
I'll start with probably the most common scenario. And let's say you're going into a corner that has a sequence of bumps. We'll call them stutter bumps. And usually when you're going into quarters, you're often decreasing speed. So you're applying the brakes as you go into that corner as well. Commonly, if your forks are a little bit on the soft side, as you go into that corner, you hit the brakes, you may feel like your rear tires skipping across the bumps or very chattery, almost like it's rebounding too quickly. In other words, you're feeling every bump. You're going as you enter into the corner. The most common reason for that feeling is there's too much compression resistance. So what's happening, again, you're hitting a certain size bump and the fork and the wheel are not compressing enough in order for the wheel to go over that bump without lifting up the entire motorcycle instead. What commonly this gets misattributed to is the rebound is too fast. And I can understand why, because they go over a sequence of bumps and they feel the wheel kind of going over each bump, and they think, man, the fork's compressing, and then it's rebounding out so quickly, it's just slamming against the next bump. So understand that's what it feels like what's happening, but in reality, 9 times out of 10 is because your compression setting is too stiff. So in that case, you're going to want to adjust your compression clicker anywhere from 1 to 2 clicks softer, or possibly even 4 to 6 clicks softer, depending on what setting the compression clicker is currently set at. In that scenario, once you do that, if you find it's getting better, would you recommend stopping there, or do you think we should keep going?
Keep going until you find the limit.
Exactly. Yes, because the reason we want to keep continuing down that, let's say, path of adjustment is exactly what Anthony said. We want to find the limit. When have we gone too soft? Now, in that specific scenario, if you're only testing in that area, meaning over that sequence of bumps, you may not find the limit. You may find you prefer the fork in that specific setting at the softest setting there is. But there's usually multiple obstacles of different style on a track or out on a trail. So you may not find the limit of that setting until you ride a different obstacle on it. So in that case, you might hit a jump and the forks bottom out too easily. So this is where the craft of bike setup comes into play, because that's when you kind of have to determine, what do I as a rider prefer more? A setup that's a little bit softer and absorbs all the bumps, but maybe bottoms out a little easy and it's hard to ride aggressively? Or do I prefer a setup where I feel a lot of the bumps, but I can ride it very aggressively and not bottom out very often? As we alluded to in the previous video, spring preload and spring rates can also have a large influence over the feel of the suspension as well. So if you're finding that your clicker does not yield the amount of change that you're after, verify that you have the proper spring installed, because if you do not, that'll be working against you. If you do have the proper spring installed and you've run out of clicks, what do you think the next option would be?
Valving.
Exactly. So nothing you can do right on the trail right there, but at least that testing gives you insight to you're going down the right path, you're in the right direction, but you ran out of adjustment externally. So the next thing you would do is you would adjust it internally through a revalve. The main functionality of the compression clicker is to control the feel of the suspension as you ride. So how the bike feels as we go over the ground and as we land from jumps. But as I'm sure you can guess, it definitely has an influence over the handle of the bike as well. Could you guess what settings the compression clicker has to be at in order to have a large influence over the handling of the bike?
At the extreme ends of the compression clicker adjustability range. So for instance, if you're all the way stiff, one of the crossover effects that you might notice between your suspension performance and your chassis performance is, let's say your fork, for instance, if you're all the way stiff on your fork, it's going to ride a little bit higher in the front. And the opposite, if you're all the way softer, your fork's probably going to be riding pretty low in the travel. And you're going to want a little bit more hold up in the travel as well.
Exactly. Yeah, you were spot on with that. Anytime you affect your compression clicker, it definitely has an effect on, let's call it your average ride height. So as you ride the bike and you're in motion. If you're just adjusting the compression clicker 2 to 3 clicks here and there, I would say the influence over the ride height is rather small. However, as he alluded to, if you're got the clicker damn near all the way in, so meaning the stiffest setting, or all the way out, that's going to have such a large influence over the amount of compression resistance you have that if it's all the way stiff, the bike's not only going to feel pretty stiff, but it's going to ride quite a bit higher than it would at any other setting from there. And same on the back end of that, meaning, as he alluded to, if the clicker is all the way soft, the valve in itself isn't going to be very effective anymore. We're going to have so much loss through the bypass circuit of the compression assembly. And that's what your clicker modifies and adjusts. So in that case, your bike's going to ride lower overall and feel softer overall. Because you got to think, as you hit these bumps, it's going to use a lot more travel, and it's likely not going to get all the way back out in its travel before you hit the next bump, and vice versa. If it's a lot stiffer, the bike's not going to compress nearly as much as you go over bumps, and it's going to have plenty of time to get extended back out all the way. So the times that your compression clicker has a very large, or say effective, influence over the handling of the bike tends to be towards the extremes. The caveat to this will be if you're in the middle, so say 10 or 12 clicks out, and you make a big adjustment change. So by that, I mean anywhere from 5 or more clicks at once. So if you go from 12 to 7 or 12 to 16, that's enough of a change that the bike will definitely ride stiffer or softer, but also ride a little bit lower or higher depending on the direction you went. And then as you keep going in that direction, it'll keep getting amplified more and more.
I think a common question that we get here at the shop, whether on the track or a trail, is somebody will come up to either myself or GB and say, how many clicks should I go, either stiffer or softer, when adjusting my suspension? And I think you hit the nail on the head there. Let's go for a big change so we can see how far the limit is. Let's go for a 4-click change, or even a 5 or more click change, so we can see how far we can really go before we have to start backtracking our way back to find that happy medium in between where you were, where we went, and right in the middle.
Yes, because it would be a bummer to be going in the right direction and not get to go all that way because maybe something odd happened, like an anomaly. In this case, it could be the placebo effect. And by that, I mean, if a rider comes to you and you tell them, hey, I made your forks 2 clicks softer, one, they want to verify that they can tell you they feel that softer. They're just naturally going to be inclined to show that they can feel the difference. But let's just say they go ride and they hit a bump weird just that one time, and the bike just responds awkwardly. That might heavily bias their opinion and think that's not the right direction. But in reality, all that happened was they just hit a bump weird and the bike responded oddly. And that's going to happen regardless sometimes, regardless of your setting. So as you talked about, it really helps to make a big enough change to where if that situation does happen, the rider can easily override that and tell the difference because it's working so much better or worse elsewhere on the track or trail. That becomes much more easier and clear to them. Does this feel better? Does it feel worse? Or does it just feel different?
One thing that I really like that you touched on earlier is you really can't adjust your bike for one specific part of the track or trail. For instance, if there is a succession of braking bumps or even acceleration bumps coming in or coming out of a corner at Fox Raceway, we can adjust your suspension to be a little bit softer, to have a little bit more hand feel or a little bit more comfort going over those bumps. So when you enter the turn, it's to be a little bit more comfortable, and as you exit the turn, it's going to be more comfortable. But when you go hit that big step up, if you're out on the main track at Fox Raceway, you're more than likely going to feel that more as you land or even take off from that jump. to be more of a heavy landing and have maybe even more of a harsh character if you go really deep onto the landing. What we're really getting at is try to not adjust your suspension for one specific part of the track. And I think that's where JB was kind of touching on earlier, is where the craft comes into play. Not only for the suspension tuner, but as a rider as well, because the extremes are never really that good. Yes, are they going to be great in one specific area? Absolutely. But is it the best all around? Not so much.
When it comes to the different brands of forks, the Showa and the KYB, they tend to click every half turn. So every half turn you do, you're going to feel the clicker click. You even hear an audible click as well. You typically get a range of 20 to 21, maybe 22 clicks on the top of the fork caps. Now the WP stuff, those seem to click every quarter turn. So you get a click more often and it's finer. And with those, you usually get a range of about 30 to 31, 32, maybe a few more clicks, depending on exactly what fork you have. Now, just because the clicker clicks more often, I wouldn't say it's, what I meant by better is performance-wise. Doesn't mean it performs better, it just means you have better adjustability or finer adjustability on that. So I think that's a nice touch that WP has on their stuff. And oftentimes you see that being implemented to some of the KYB and Showa kit suspension.
Now, is there ever a time when you shouldn't adjust your compression clicker?
I don't know if there isn't a time you shouldn't, but I think there's scenarios that happen where riders misattribute what to adjust instead. So mainly touching on our video series, chassis versus suspension. If you're having any handling issues with the bike, such as just not steering as sharp as you like it to, or maybe it's too twitchy, first look at the chassis. Look at fork tube height, sag. First rule out all those things first beforehand before you start adjusting the compression clicker to achieve a handling feat that you're after. You're not wrong in saying that doesn't have an effect or it can't achieve what you're after. But again, sometimes it'll come at an expense of somewhere else. So usually we want to try to modify suspension or change it with the least amount of compromise or expense of that hurting how the suspension performs somewhere else. So my main thing would be just handling. If you feel the bike can handle better in a certain way, please first look at your chassis setup. And again, spring rates, preload, rider sag, fork tube height. Please check out all that and verify all that's where it should be before you start making clicker adjustments to try to further change how low or high the bike rides as you ride it. Some tips for you guys that do motocross and ride off-road sometimes. If you want to know what to do with your clickers, go all the way soft. Just turn your compression clicker to the softest setting you can go. Rest assured, it's still not going to be as soft as a true off-road setting. I know some people are worried about to adjust your clickers to the extremes, all the way in or all the way out. It does not hurt the suspension in any way. The suspension does not care. It's not biased towards any clicker. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It has no preference on numbers. So if you're a moto guy and you can go ride off-road sometime, just go all the way soft. If you're a moto guy and you can go hit ramps, you don't have ramp suspension, go all the way stiff. Like turn that clicker to where it does not stop. Even then, your compression will not be nearly as stiff as a true ramp setting. Same applies for you off-road guys. For you off-road guys that want to go hit up the vet track or even the main track at your local motocross track, dude, turn your compression clickers in all the way until they stop. And then maybe back them out just one click so you still have some suppleness over the small bumps.
Comparing between OEM valving and getting a revalve, whether it's Ride JBI, which hopefully it is, if not any other reputable suspension tuner, does it have any profound effect on your compression clicker at all?
It doesn't change the mechanics of what's happening. So that is still the same. But typically what happens with the revalve is we're taking your suspension and I don't want to say we're narrowing the window of it, but we're making it more specific to that certain rider and the type of riding that we're doing. So because of that, oftentimes your compression clicker will feel more effective now because their tuning range is more effective and their suspension setup internally is now so specifically set up towards them that even if they run the stiffest setting or the softest setting on there, it's still very well set up for the type of riding that they're doing. So any clicker adjustment they do in there is still going to work well. It'll change the feel of the fork, but in a good way, in a way that's predictable and acceptable.
So what is the purpose of this video? This video is designed to help you have a more intuitive and deeper understanding of how your fork compression clicker works. Again, we will have a separate video going over your shock compression adjuster, both low speed and high speed. But we both hope that after watching this video, you have a better understanding of when to adjust your fork compression clicker, how to adjust your fork compression clicker, and most importantly, the effects that you should feel out on the track or trail after you adjust your compression clicker. Thank you guys for tuning in to episode 4, which is arguably the highest requested episode of chassis versus suspension. If you like this content, be sure to subscribe to the Ride GBI YouTube channel, follow us on Instagram, and ring that notification bell so you guys know when we post a new video.
If you guys got any questions, leave them below in the comments and we will touch on them in the future video we got coming out next.
See ya.